This is the Levant. And this right here is Lebanon, a small diverse country on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, known for its rich history, snow-capped mountains, and vibrant culture. From the outside looking in, we see that Lebanon spans 10,000 square kilometers. Still, if we look a little closer, we see that it holds a history much larger than its size. The world thinks they know Lebanon. They only see the headlines: war, destruction, economic collapse, resilience, and geopolitical matches played by neighboring giants like Syria and Israel, ignoring the darker reality. Internally, Lebanon has been systematically hollowed out over the centuries by deep sectarian tensions, fragile compromises, and a system built to fracture. So, how did everything start? I'm MJ Sahrawi from Clamour, and in this two-part documentary we are going to open the book on the history of Lebanon and dive deeper into it. Because, to be real, Lebanon is exactly that, a book rich in history, where every community and every empire has written its own chapter. In this first part, we're going back 500 years to the very beginning, tracing the emergence of Lebanese statecraft from the autonomous emirate of Mount Lebanon through the chaotic decades of foreign intervention up to the mid-20th century independence. Then in part 2, we will dive deep into the modern fire, the devastating civil wars, and the rise of Hezbollah, sifting through the myths that took place in the minds of the Lebanese and anyone interested in its history. Okay, to be honest with you, choosing a point where to start this chapter is quite confusing. Why? Well, because in the case of Lebanon, there is no particular starting point when it comes to these types of topics. As we said earlier, Lebanon is a book, and everyone has their own chapter in that book. For example, if we want to talk or enter from a civilizational window, we need to start from a very, very early stage in history, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 years ago.
This is literally on top of one of the blocks, and look at this. I mean, you can barely fit it in the camera lens, it's so big. This doesn't stop, this just goes on and on and on. So we're just in the courtyard of the temple of Bacchus, which you can see there. And this is where all the mega stones are, just on the opposite side. And I just walked along here, and there's more here. Behind it, there's more mega blocks. So we're not talking one layer of mega blocks, we're talking entire platform. You can see slightly smaller ones above it, quite large ones up there. They're actually quite impressive. This is the famous Western Wall. You can see the huge 3 trilithons. They're not this level, these are the 400-ton stones. So one's above, 3 of those 800 plus tons each. That came from the same quarry of nearby as a stone of the pregnant woman. So it's pretty impressive. Even the stones just going around this side, the 400 tonners, and going along here, are still very impressive. Just to give you a sense of scale, I'm standing right next to it. This is just utterly remarkable, and just a deep antiquity without a doubt.
If you want to enter from a political door when it comes to the era where Lebanon took that name and took that political and administrative identity, at least you have to start with the Mutasarrifate, or maybe a little earlier. And if we want to look at it from the effects and changes window that shaped Lebanon, and particularly modern Lebanon, we have to start from the modern age, the late 16th and 17th century, with the Ottomans. According to Kamal Salibi, the foundation of modern Lebanese identity and its complex sectarian system was shaped during the era of the Ottomans, rather than being created by the later European mandate. So, without further ado, let's start with the rise of the Ma'an dynasty in 1506. Fakhruddin I became the first historically verified ruler or emir of the Ma'an dynasty in Mount Lebanon, with recognition from Sultan Selim I, then ruler of the Ottoman Empire. The dynasty reached its peak under his grandson Fakhruddin II in the late 16th century, the so-called father of modern Lebanon. And this brings us to the first myth. Actually, Fakhruddin was a Syrian strongman who was given leeway by the Ottomans to subdue and destroy other provincial leaderships in Syria on their behalf, and who was himself destroyed in the end. Yes, as you heard, Fakhruddin II was an Ottoman appointee with a lot of ambition who expanded and we can say occupied nearly the entire Levant. To some degree, he got in touch with Italian city-states like Tuscany and Genoa because he saw them as a source of wealth. He wasn't really thinking about Lebanese identity. Frankly, at the time, nationalism didn't exist. People were considered Ottoman subjects just as they were previously under Mamluk rule. So we can say that during his reign, the Mount Lebanon Emirate operated as a highly autonomous tax farming system. This ultimately led to his end. After his expansion, Sultan Murad IV decided to publicly execute him for treason in 1635. After this move, we saw a shift in strategy. The Fakhruddin II crisis forced Istanbul to strictly tighten its grip on local emirates. Before that, the Ottoman Empire was following a principle. As long as local emirs safely collected taxes under the Eltizam system, secured the annual Hajj pilgrimage route through Damascus, and maintained regional peace, Istanbul granted them immense autonomy. This was the pre-Fakhruddin era. But after him and after he broke this trust by forming foreign alliances with Europe and building a private army, this triggered an aggressive shift under Sultan Murad IV. After him, when they chose Emir Mulhim, they didn't do it out of goodwill. They observed how he secured the tax farms of southern Mount Lebanon, proving he was the only leader capable of actually enforcing order and delivering taxes. It was strictly maintained by the Ottomans, even with Ahmed Ma'an, the very last ruler of the Ma'an dynasty, who spent his life fighting to survive their divide and rule tactics. In 1697, Ahmed died, leaving no surviving sons. His only close male relative was his youngest uncle, Hussein Ma'an. Still, he flatly refused the throne because he had achieved a highly successful, high-ranking career as an Ottoman diplomat and court official in Istanbul, where, by the way, he died in that same year, 1697. With Hussein gone and Ahmed Ma'an leaving no male heir, the nobility, the powerful Druze sheikhs of the influential Jumplat clan, met at a grand council in the village of Samkania to choose the new leader. They decided to pivot to the female line, so they passed succession to the Shihab family based on the maternal line. Bashir Shihab I, the son of Ahmed Ma'an's sister, Sihrnada Ma'an. We can say that this maternal connection is exactly what paved the way for this dynasty to legitimately inherit Mount Lebanon. Now you might be wondering how the Shihab family became Maronite when they came from the same lineage as the Ma'ans, who themselves were Sunni Muslims. Well, here is where a common historical misconception happens. Because when the Shihab family took over the crown in 1697, they were not Maronite, they were Sunni Muslims. The transition happened gradually over the next century, when the region faced a shift in population due to a rapid migration of Maronites from coastal Syria. That swift migration led to a shift in population in Mount Lebanon. To maintain political stability, the Shihab emirs aligned themselves with Maronite feudal lords like the Kazan sheikhs. And it wasn't until the late 18th century that prominent branches of the Shihab family converted secretly and then publicly to Maronite Catholicism. The most famous ruler who was himself a Maronite due to that gradual adoption of the Maronite faith in the Shihab family was Emir Bashir II, the most controversial, polarizing ruler. Okay, now we're talking, because after Emir Bashir came to power, Mount Lebanon saw an acceleration in the pace of events, becoming a volatile, unstable, and fragile region. Emir Bashir II was known for his pragmatism and oblique leadership. He wasn't looking or acting out of religious devotion or ideological loyalty, but out of pure political survival and the desire to centralize his own power. Yes, to centralize his own power. Bashir saw in himself a sort of grandeur and the prowess to be the new Fakhruddin II. He was obsessed with political stability, so by navigating a complex web of alliances amidst a shift in population, he redrew the political and social map of Mount Lebanon. This gave him a loyal tax base, reducing his dependency on the Druze elites, which means on the Ottomans. To give you some perspective, the Druze sheikhs and elites were the ones responsible for collecting taxes, or the tax farmers, Emir Bashir disdained them not because they were Druze, but because they stood directly in the way of his vision to become the 2.0 version of Fakhreddin, demolishing the traditional Lebanese feudal system, or Muqattaji. Why do I say that? Because there is another myth that circulates among many people, especially the Druze. Because of what he did to them, and because he allied himself with the Maronites against them, they say Emir Bashir targeted the Druze out of pure hatred. But in reality, he showed hatred to anyone who could threaten his chair. Most notably, this included Bashir Jumblat, his chief rival who held the vast majority of hereditary land and tax farming rights. This confrontation was the first decision that led to the future explosion, but the second was his truly fatal mistake. During the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, Ottoman Sultan Mahmud II realized his military could not stop the Greek rebels, so he looked for help from his powerful modernized Egyptian vassal, Muhammad Ali Pasha. The latter sent his son Ibrahim Pasha and the Egyptian army to crush the Greeks. In exchange, Ali requested control over the Levant. Sultan Mahmud accepted and even promised it to him. But after the victory, Ali realized it was a broken promise, which was the core reason for the war in the 1830s. Muhammad Ali sent his son Ibrahim Pasha to invade the Levant in October 1831, sparking the First Turco-Egyptian War and rapidly seizing Ottoman territories from Palestine up to Anatolia. In this period, Emir Bashir II gambled his entire political career on backing Muhammad Ali Pasha against the Ottoman Sultan. Frankly, he didn't have a choice. When Ibrahim Pasha marched into the Levant, regional leaders were forced to choose a side. The Emir chose Egypt for two major reasons. One, sensing the stronger power. Especially after the victory over the Greeks, Bashir correctly assessed that Ali's highly disciplined, French-trained army was worlds apart from the old-fashioned, let's say, decaying Ottoman military forces. So, opposing Ibrahim Pasha would have immediately destroyed him. And two, crushing his local rivals. Basically, he saw the Egyptian alliance as an opportunity that aligned with his goals. He was looking for anything to reduce, by any means, Lebanon's dependency on the Ottoman Sultan, and as we mentioned earlier, to eliminate his domestic rival, Bashir Jumblat. For most of history, whether under the Romans, Abbasids, or early Ottomans, the average peasant in the Levant didn't care about the high politics of their rulers, as long as taxes were predictable and local religious customs were left alone. However, the Egyptian occupation completely shattered this status quo, especially for the Jews. The Jews were uniquely and brutally oppressed by Ibrahim Pasha's troops, and Emir Bashir II weaponized the Maronite Christians to force them into submission. But how? Historically, the Druze were a proud, autonomous warrior class in Mount Lebanon. Ibrahim Pasha demanded two things that completely violated their traditional rights. First, total disarmament, forcing them to hand over all weapons to the Egyptian state. And second, forced conscription, compelling their young men to fight in the regular Egyptian army. Of course, the Jews refused to surrender their weapons or to fight for Egypt. Because of that, Bashir II raised a massive militia composed almost entirely of Maronite Christians, allied them with Ibrahim Pasha's troops, and sent them into the Druze heartland to crush the rebellion. This marked a massive shift in Lebanese history. For centuries, conflict in the mountains had been feudal, not religious. By using Maronite soldiers to enforce brutal Egyptian policies, Emir Bashir and Ibrahim Pasha planted the seeds of deep, bitter sectarian hatred. Yes, this pragmatism from the Emir and Ibrahim indeed led to widespread hatred later, but let's talk a little bit about the Maronites under Emir Bashir's alliance, how they lived and how they went from being his allies to becoming his rivals who fought against him in the 1840 Civil War. Initially, the Maronites lived relatively well compared to the Druze. Because the Emir was an ally of Egypt, the Maronites enjoyed the benefits of the alliance. For instance, they received an exemption from early conscription. While Ibrahim Pasha was forcibly dragging Muslims and Jews into his army, he actually exempted Christians from military service. And following the footsteps of his father, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who had actively manipulated and allied with competing European powers against the Ottoman Sultan, Ibrahim opened the Levant to them, allowing them to trade freely. The Maronites, who controlled the lucrative silk trade and had deep ties with French merchants, grew very wealthy during the early 1830s. But guess what? This didn't last long. In 1839, the turning point happened. Egyptian troops fought the Battle of Nazib against the Ottomans. Seeking to capitalize on this, the Ottoman Grand Vizier Mehmed Husrev Pasha attempted to politically destabilize Bashir's rule in Mount Lebanon by maneuvering exiled Druze notables against him. In response, after running out of money and soldiers, Emir Bashir betrayed the Maronites. He imposed the exact same heavy taxes and forced conscription on them that he had previously used against the Druze. Suddenly, the Maronites realized the dark side of his pragmatism. They realized they were never Emir Bashir's favored allies. They were just temporary tools in his geopolitical game. This is where an unexpected alliance happened. Many people think the 1840 conflict was nothing but a civil war between the Druze and the Maronites. But actually, it was a unified, joint revolution against Ibrahim Pasha and Emir Bashir. In 1840, Maronite, Druze, Sunni and Shia leaders met secretly at a church. They signed a historic covenant, swearing to put aside their religious differences and fight as one unified Lebanese front to expel the Egyptians. An instinctive alliance proving the enemy of my enemy theory. However, following this victory in October 1840, the alliance shattered almost immediately, plunging Mount Lebanon into a brutal civil war by September 1841. Once Emir Bashir and the Egyptians were exiled, the Druze feudal lords returned from banishment. They demanded the return of their ancestral lands and hereditary tax collecting rights. However, the Maronites and the newly asserted Maronite Church refused to surrender them. In response, the Druze launched a preemptive military campaign to restore their ancient privileges by force. This is where sectarian violence broke out, proving that peace in Mount Lebanon lasts only until sectarianism redraws the map of power. Well, to be real, some people think that the Maronites are the ones who started the war. Others say it was because of a partridge. Yes, a partridge. Let me explain. Shortly after the accession of Bashir III, an incident touched off the first Christian Druze conflagration. It consisted of the shooting by a Deir al-Qamar Christian of a partridge on the property of a Druze of the Abu Naked family in adjacent Baqlin. Now, whether it was because of a partridge, a fight between two kids, one Druze and one Maronite, or the refusal to surrender land, all of these incidents were just a slow-burning fuse. They couldn't withstand the immense tension, and they ultimately blazed into the War of 1841. This aligns perfectly with the insight of historian Philip Hitti, who noted, before the 1840s, the alignment among Christians and Jews was feudal and partisan rather than religious and denominational. This conflict lasted 20 years from 1840 to 1860. This period was defined by the Double Qaimaqamate system, which was created by the Ottoman government under intense pressure from European powers in 1842. As you know, in the history of civil wars, external interventions are inevitable. Whether in the United States, France, or Lebanon, civil wars undermine local law, order, and central government authority. This creates a power vacuum, leaving an open door for ambitious neighbors, or in Lebanon's case, global superpowers to step in. The Qaimaqamate system divided the Mount Lebanon region into north and south. The northern part was governed by the Maronites, while the southern part was for the Druze. When this system was implemented by European superpowers, it wasn't meant to be a lasting solution, nor was it made to solve the conflict. Indeed, it was designed merely to manage it. One of this system's major downsides was demographic. They didn't fully pull back the curtains on the mountain to assess exactly where the Jews and the Maronites actually lived. So, when the division happened, many Jews found themselves living as a minority in the northern Maronite Qaimaqam, and the same went for the Maronites in the southern Druze Qaimaqam. For 20 years, conflicts and tensions kept going. It was during this exact period that foreign powers locked in their proxy rules more than ever before. The north, the Maronite Qaimaqam, was micromanaged and armed by friends, with Austria competing for Catholic influence. In the south, the Jews were armed and micromanaged by Great Britain. We also cannot overlook the Russian presence, operating under the flag of protecting Greek Orthodox minorities. Ultimately, we can say that this system was basically designed to palpate the pulse of the sick man of Europe, testing the limits of Ottoman sovereignty and exposing just how fragile it really was. In 1860, massive massacres forced the European superpowers to step in. A conference was held in Paris between European superpowers and the Ottoman Empire to establish a new system, an alternative to the Qaimaqam, engineered to break the loop of conflict. The core idea was to reunify, but proportionally. Let me explain. After the previous failure, superpowers decided that Mount Lebanon must be reunified under a single non-Lebanese Ottoman Christian governor, the Mutasarrifate. To ensure that no sect felt oppressed, they created a system in which power was meticulously distributed via the Administrative Council, or Majlis al-Idara. This was a 12-member council representing the main communities of the mountain. The Maronites had 4 seats, the Jews had 3, the Greek Orthodox had 2, while the Greek Catholics, Sunni Muslims, and Shia each had 1 seat. And guess what? It worked. For over 50 years, from 1861 until 1914, Mount Lebanon experienced its most peaceful and economically prosperous golden age. During the Mutasarrifate era, Mount Lebanon opened up to the world. Trade thrived, and ships thronged the port of Beirut, making a crucial turning point that later led to the foundation of Greater Lebanon in the 1920s. However, following the 1860 massacres, the Saudi Ottoman Grand Vizier Fuad Pasha and Medhed Pasha co-drafted the 1864 Wilayat law. Their first move was to merge Damascus and Sidon into the massive Wilayah of Syria. They did this to prevent Maronite Christian or Jews' autonomy from spreading to other regions, deliberately cutting off the mountain from its rich agriculture hinterlands like the Bekaa Valley and key ports, keeping it dependent on the empire. They established a massive province called Syria, with borders stretching from Aleppo in the north to Aqaba in the south, including Tripoli and Latakia, while keeping Mount Lebanon as an isolated Mutasarrifate. Geographically, it was completely surrounded by this Ottoman province, all to avoid repeating previous failed models. But these borders didn't last long. By 1888, the global game had changed. Under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the empire faced a new reality. Beirut had become an absolute economic monster. By the late 1880s, Beirut's port was handling 11% of the entire Ottoman Empire's international trade. Because Beirut was booming, France was treating it as its personal, let's say, playground in the Levant. French merchants, missionaries, and bankers were establishing a shadow empire in the city. The Ottomans felt the threat, so they decided to elevate Beirut into its own provincial capital, the Wilayah of Beirut. By doing this, the Ottoman state could match French ambition with massive state modernization. They built grand administrative buildings like the Petit Sérail, public squares, and state schools. It was a clear message to France: Beirut is a modern imperial Ottoman city, not a French colony. Hopefully, you have a solid grasp of the period from the 17th century to the 1920s. Now, I'm sure you have noticed the swift, fast-paced events, how all of this happened in a relatively short period of time. We moved from the 19th century with Emir Bashir II to Ibrahim Pasha, then arrived at the malicious Qaimaqam system before transitioning to the Mutasarrifate era, where Mount Lebanon lived in peace for over 50 years, leading up to the establishment of Greater Lebanon. In all of this motion, fast motion shall we say, there were two crucial factors. First, the external factor, the Ottoman Empire. Because the region fell under its legitimacy, its foreign foes, the European superpowers, constantly agitated the sick man's mind, forcing him to react rather than act. Second, the internal factor, defined by sectarian conflicts, most notably between the Druze and the Maronites. This admixture meant the continuation of the same structural equation: internal conflict on one side and an international regional dimension on the other. Now, what brought us to Greater Lebanon? In the 1920s, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, France entered, and Greater Lebanon emerged. Actually, when people talk about how Greater Lebanon was created, many overlook the social and intellectual climate. They focus their attention solely on the political climate. The period from 1860 to 1920 was defined by various ideological tendencies that witnessed Lebanon's prominent role in contributing the Arab Renaissance, known as the Nahda. Many Lebanese figures were behind it, such as Boutros el-Bustani, well known as one of the major characters and main pillars of this period. In 1858, al-Bustani stood and delivered a sermon on the role and ability of the Arabic language to assimilate modern sciences, knowledge, and the Renaissance. This foundational speech for the Nahda championed the Arabic language as the dynamic, unifying vehicle for Arab identity, modernization, and scientific advancement. So we can say we had a strong tendency towards Arabic. Another track Lebanon took was a tendency towards Syria. According to the historian Boutros Abu Manna, around 1860, at the very beginning of the Mutasarrifate era, the wali or governor of Damascus went to Beirut to meet with the elites. I'm talking about the Christian elites. He encouraged them and whispered about the idea of Syria, urging them to connect with the Syrian hinterland. This is why we notice that many prominent Maronite intellectuals didn't initially speak of or focus on a separate Lebanese state. Instead, they focused heavily on Syria and wider Arabism, exploring historical roots stretching back to the pre-Islamic era and Jahiliyyah poetry. They spent their entire intellectual energy focusing on Syria. Another pivotal event happened in this period. Actually, in that same year, 1860, a French expedition began excavating Phoenician antiquities. And guess what? Another trend started, a new unprecedented historical phenomenon for the Arab and Islamic world. This incident played a huge role later in reframing Lebanon's identity in the region. By the end of the 19th century, a conversation began about a Phoenician Lebanon and how it existed long before the Arab era. To be real, this came with a lot of exaggeration. Yes, part of it was true, like how the Phoenicians dominated the seas and built centers of commerce, but it involved a lot of aggrandizement. When we look a little closer, we find that reputable historians never made these grandiose claims. Instead, they came from ideologists rather than field researchers. Yet, arguments like these gained an audience and carried noticeable weight on the streets of Lebanon. As a consequence, the idea of a uniquely Christian Lebanon started to form. The story of the Maronites as Christian highlanders who maintained their autonomy between the Byzantine Empire and the Umayyad Caliphate. You see how many pathways and trends were circulating. We had Boutros el-Bustani's political, cultural leaning towards an Arab identity. We had leanings toward the Syrian idea. And by the way, other movements were linked to Syria, with many people demanding a return to a historical Greater Syria that predated the Ottoman borders of 1864. Finally, we had the Phoenician trend and its deep links with Lebanese Christianity. Now you might be wondering, before the 1860s, the region was defined by a highly competitive relationship between the Jews and the Maronites. Were the Jews pushed out of the story? Actually, yes, they were somewhat absent compared to the Maronites, and Christians in general. To be fair, they were notable Druze figures who led intellectuals of the era, like Emir Shihab Arslan, who stood firmly with the Ottoman Empire against the Arab revolt. He saw the downfall of the Ottomans as a direct threat to Islam, and he became a key leader of the Islamic reformist current in this period. Still, Druze intellectual output wasn't at the same volume as the Christian presence. This Christian dominance was fueled by commerce, missionary schools, and international trade, which paved the way for European, especially French, influence. To be honest, I don't mean to diminish anyone. The vast majority of Maronites were still peasants, but a significant portion of them became elites connected to the modern global era. This didn't just include Maronites, but also other Christians who became Lebanese later, like Michel Shihab, the Iraqi Chaldean immigrant who marked his presence in Lebanese history, co-wrote the Lebanese constitution in the 1920s, and became one of the main architects behind the Phoenician ideology of Lebanon. As we said, it was led by ideologues and not historians. We also have a prominent and influential figure, Rashid Reza, one of the most influential Sunni jurists of his generation. He lived from 1865 to 1935 and was a Lebanese from Tripoli. He was the owner of the Al-Manar Journal, an anti-Ottoman publication. Unlike Arslan, Reza stood firmly against the Ottoman Empire and the policies of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. After being exiled from Lebanon to Egypt, and even under Ottoman legitimacy there, he founded this journal in 1898, which served as a window for many Islamist ideologies. He supported any Arab revolt, especially those in the Levant. A decade later, in 1908, after the Hamidian despotism came to an end, he returned to Tripoli, Lebanon. He later supported Sharif Hussein during the Arab Revolt. Afterward, once Syria and Lebanon were divided, he served as the ambassador of the Syrian delegation in Geneva. Why did I mention this character? Well, to give you an idea of how much history changed in this short period, from the 1860s to the 1920s. A massive numbers of events happened, and individuals were deeply impacted by this pace. Rashid Reza lived for 70 years, and as we saw, his life and ideas were directly shaped by that rhythm of events. Imagine the average person who went to sleep thinking he was an Ottoman subject, only to wake up the next morning and see that the Ottoman era was over. The Sykes-Picot Agreement has drawn crooked borders across the Levant, and the French Mandate was now preparing to enter Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and the Syrian coast, forging its pathway directly to Beirut. That was the case in Lebanon and Syria during this period. The Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the region into a French zone of influence, seen in the blue zone here, covering the Syrian coast and Mount Lebanon. Meanwhile, the interior Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs was supposed to become an Arab state under French oversight. In October 1918, immediately after the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Allied forces carved up the region into temporary military zones. French troops landed on the coast and took control of Beirut and Mount Lebanon. The local pro-French Christian population welcomed them, making the French administrative transition immediate and smooth. Patriarch Elias Peter Hwayek acted effectively as the supreme diplomat for the Lebanese cause at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. He personally traveled to France at 76 years old to lead the second Lebanese delegation, meeting directly with French Premier Georges Clemenceau. He presented a famous memorandum demanding that the historical borders of Lebanon be restored under a French mandate. Because of this successful lobbying, General Henry Gouraud officially stood next to Patriarch Hwayek in Beirut on September 1, 1920, to declare the creation of the state of Greater Lebanon. General Gouraud entered Lebanon to secure French colonial control over the Middle East and enforce the Sykes-Picot Agreement. France had been promised control over Syria and Lebanon during World War I, and Gouraud was sent as the High Commissioner to turn that secret promise into reality. While the Christian majority didn't complain, with many acting as direct allies to France, there were notable tensions with the Muslim population, especially the Shia in the south. They stood firmly against the French presence, aligning themselves instead with Syria and the idea of Arab unity. But overall, even the Muslims who rejected this mandate didn't fight at first, keeping a burning resentment hidden in their chests. General Gouraud exploited this unstable climate. With the strategic withdrawal of British backing for King Faisal, Syria became vulnerable. On July 24, 1920, at the Battle of Maysalou, Gouraud's troops entered Damascus and overthrew the king. Fresh off his victory in Syria, General Gouraud stood next to Patriarch Huwayk in Beirut to officially declare the creation of the state of Greater Lebanon in September 1920, unlocking a new chapter in the Levant. But to be fair, now that you have heard about how Patriarch Huwayk acted, you might think his decision was driven by a hatred for Muslims, or perhaps a greedy power grab for Maronite rule. Actually, we can't assume that, since we haven't stepped into his shoes as a leader in 1919. But by looking closely at the context of this period, we can see that his decisions were driven by existential terror, deep historical trauma, and most importantly, a desperate desire to secure the economic survival of his people. In the period between 1915 and 1918, the Ottoman Empire placed a strict foot blockade on the Christian mountain, while locust plague destroyed the remaining crops. Just 1 year before Huwayk went to Paris, Mount Lebanon suffered the Great Famine, which wiped out nearly 1/3 of the population. Because of this, Huwayk demanded the addition of fertile agricultural lands like the Bekaa Valley and Akkar, along with coastal ports like Beirut and Tripoli. He knew that without these regions, a future Lebanon would literally starve to death again. So he went to France and allied himself in the name of the Christian mountain. By the way, many people understand the French intervention as classic imperialism and colonialism, because of how the French behaved and how the local population experienced it. And yes, it was colonialism, but not like the traditional colonial occupations that happened in Algeria or British-occupied Egypt. The League of Nations established the mandate system under Article 22 of its covenant. Syria and Lebanon were classified as Class A mandates. Unlike Algeria, which France declared to be an integral province of France, or Egypt, which Britain occupied indefinitely for economic and strategic control, a Class A mandate had a legal expiration date. Its explicit goal was independence. So why did the locals call it istamar, colonialism anyway? It was simply because how French military officers and politicians on the ground treated them. Despite the fancy legal language, France behaved like a direct colonial master, and that is why people rightfully call it istamar. For instance, General Gouraud held supreme executive, legislative, and judicial power. He could, and often did, dissolve local parliaments, rewrite constitutions, and censor the press whenever he pleased. There was also economic exploitation. France tied the local currency, the Syrian Lebanese lira, directly to the French franc, forcing the local economy to rely entirely on Paris. Furthermore, we can't overlook the brutal military suppression when the Syrians revolted. France acted like a conqueror rather than a helpful advisor, using heavy artillery and airplanes to bomb civilian quarters in Damascus during the 1925 Great Syrian Revolt. So, I hope you get the picture. The French mandate was designed to look like a civilized pathway to independence on paper, but it was executed with the heavy, arrogant hand of European imperialism. The French mandate over Lebanon lasted for 23 years, from 1920 to 1943. Its end was absolutely not simple. It was a high-stakes, dramatic showdown of power that involved a constitutional rebellion, a military crackdown, mass protests, and global geopolitical pressure. In 1940, Nazi Germany invaded and occupied France. Control of Lebanon initially fell to the pro-Nazi Vichy French regime. In 1941, British and Free French anti-Nazi troops invaded Lebanon to kick the Vichy forces out. To win the local population's cooperation, the anti-Nazi French general Georges Catroux promised Lebanon its eventual independence. However, once the fighting stopped, France tried to backtrack and maintain its imperial grip, refusing to actually give up power. As history shows, this was a familiar pattern. By 1943, Lebanese leaders realized how weak the Allied powers were and how heavily distracted they were by World War II, especially France. So the unexpected happened. The Christians led by Bashar al-Khoury and the Sunni Muslims led by Riyad al-Sulh did something France never expected. They united. They forged an unwritten agreement called the National Pact of 1943. For the Christians, they shifted away from viewing France as their exclusive garden. For the Muslims, they accepted the distinct Lebanese identity and entity instead of pushing for immediate pan-Arab unity or a merger with Syria. With this united front, al-Khoury was elected president and al-Sulh became prime minister. On November 8, 1943, capitalizing on the tight spot France was in, the new Lebanese parliament executed a brilliant political ambush. They voted unanimously to amend the constitution, unilaterally erasing all mentions of France and amend it. Of course, France didn't accept this. The French High Commissioner Jean Helleux reacted with immediate colonial aggression. On November 11, 1943, French troops arrested President al-Khoury, Prime Minister al-Sulh, and almost the entire cabinet in the middle of the night. The French thought that after this aggressive, preemptive move, Lebanese citizens would surrender their dreams. But instead of backing down, Lebanese of all sects flooded the streets. Massive strikes and violent clashes erupted between protesters and French soldiers. When Britain saw this French brutality, it feared it would spark a wider rebellion and disrupt the Allied war effort. The British government issued an ultimatum demanding that France release the leaders immediately. Humiliated, isolated, and facing total chaos on the ground, France surrendered.